Welcome to Teleforum, a podcast of the Federalist Society's practice groups. I'm Dean Reuter, Vice President, General Counsel, and Director of Practice Groups at the Federalist Society. For exclusive access to live recordings of practice group Teleforum calls, become a Federalist Society member today at fedsoc.org.
Welcome, everyone, to the Federalist Society's Teleforum conference call. As this afternoon, December 17, 2020, and we're sitting down with Chairman Ajit Pai to discuss his tenure at the FCC. Will be followed by a panel discussion. I'm Nick Marr, Assistant Director of Practice Groups at the Federalist Society. As always, please note that expressions of opinion on today's call are those of our experts. I should also mention that this is a call open to members only. So I'm just going to introduce our moderator before he takes the show away. We're pleased to be joined this afternoon by Mr. Bryan Tramont. He's Managing Partner at Wilkinson Barker Knauer and the prolific head of our Telecommunications and Electronic Media Practice Group that's sponsoring this call today. So with that, thanks for being with us, Bryan. I'll hand the floor to you.
Thank you, Nick. It's always a pleasure, and we really appreciate all the hard work that you do to put together the Society's program, so thank you. It is a real pleasure. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, to sit down with Chairman Pai and discuss his tenure as chairman of the FCC. I will. We don't have much time, so I'll move along expeditiously through his background. But he was born in Parsons, Kansas, a fine town that I've had the honor of visiting. I graduated from Harvard and University of Chicago Law School. He served as a law clerk. He worked at DOJ. He's worked in the industry. He's worked on Capitol Hill. He worked at the FCC. He was in private practice. And then he was nominated by President Obama to serve on the FCC in 2012 and then became chairman in 2017. My big takeaway from this, Mr. Chairman, is I want to congratulate you because it's clear this is the longest you've ever held a single job.
I see you've been collaborating behind the scenes with my mother, who's made the same observation. Still hold out hope that medical school is the next step.
Those of us who are your friends and care about you had been worried before, but now we know that you can hold a job for an extended period of time. And it's obviously it's been a tremendous run, and we're obvious as a society, as a federal society, and as an American, I'm sad to see your tenure come to an end because it's been a terrific run, and you've done so much good for the American people. And I want to try to explore some of the different policy initiatives that you've undertaken during your tenure. And let's start with the digital divide. I mean, I mentioned Parsons, Kansas at the top, and it's a rural community with connectivity challenges like many rural communities around the country. And closing that digital divide has been a central goal of your chairmanship. So how do you think we've done as a country, and what should be happening next?
A great question. Before I get to it, though, Bryan, let me just thank you for hosting this conversation. I've really admired your work over the years, including at the Commission, and also thank the Federal Society for hosting me today, but also for the support over the years. It's been an incredibly important forum for discussing policy issues, including those within the FCC's bailiwick. For my first full day as chairman, January 24th of 2017, I've made clear that closing that digital divide would be the agency's top priority, and I think we've met that priority in many different ways. Used all the tools in the toolbox to ensure that every American, regardless of where he or she happens to live, has access to what I call digital opportunity. And there are two basic tools that we've used. One is, of course, our direct federal subsidies through the Universal Service Fund, and the other is through regulatory reforms. As to the first, we just recently concluded, as some folks might know, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund Phase 1 reverse auction. And in a nutshell, this first phase alone will direct almost $9 billion to connect 10 million Americans across the country that don't have broadband at the FCC's definition. And that first phase alone is going to really reduce the number of Americans who don't have access. Phase 2 now has approximately $11 billion available, so it'll be interesting to see what the next administration does with that. But I'm hopeful that using that phase 2, we'll be able to color in, if you will, some of the areas where your neighbor might have broadband, but you don't. In terms of regulatory reforms, I mean, we've done so much to make sure that we make the business case for broadband deployment as strong as possible for private companies. Getting quicker and cheaper access to utility poles, getting rid of utility-style regulation of the internet, modernizing some of our regulations to encourage the migration from copper to fiber, encouraging new companies to enter the space like SpaceX and fixed wireless companies and others. Our goal here is, as I said, to make sure that if you're willing to raise capital and hire a work crew, no regulation will stand in your way when it comes to connecting people. And I'd like to say that we've made substantial progress over the last 4 years, and hopefully that will continue into the future.
And when you obviously one of the things that's been front of mind for all of us for almost a year now is the pandemic and this, the changing demands placed on our network and the importance of universal connectivity during the pandemic. Tell us about your policy approach to that and how it dovetails with your larger commitment on the digital divide.
I think, if anything, the pandemic has underscored how important broadband is, and it's ended any debate once and for all over the importance of broadband in our lives. Whether you're working from home or learning at home or engaging with a healthcare provider from home, that broadband connection is increasingly critical. And so we've seen it as our role to, number one, continue our bread and butter work. A lot of the reforms we've taken have enabled us to have really strong broadband networks before anyone even heard of COVID-19, but also to act very quickly and decisively over the last 9 months to attack this problem in discrete ways. So, for example, early on, when I recognized that millions of Americans would be working from home, I asked Congress to give us emergency funding and authorization to set up a telehealth program to ensure that healthcare providers weren't exposed to patients who were coming into a bricks and mortar facility, and conversely, that patients would be safe and they wouldn't have to come into a bricks and mortar facility and risk exposure. Congress did that in the CARES Act, and we immediately executed that authority, distributing $200 million to 539 healthcare providers from New York City to Navajo Nation. Similarly, on our own initiative, we also acted very quickly to give temporary access to spectrum to companies from T-Mobile in New York City to fixed wireless providers like Amplex and Lucky, Ohio, that enabled them to boost the reach of their networks and the strength of their networks to ensure that consumers would be able to use broadband as needed. And those are the types of things that we've been able to do because we've emphasized over the years a culture of responsiveness and nimbleness and just collaboration with the other government agencies or Congress or the private sector. And hopefully that, as the pandemic recedes, we'll maintain that culture to make sure that we can address future emergencies like the pandemic.
I would also just, another word of praise, if I may, but I also think you were an early leader across the federal government in the pledge to ensure that people stayed connected during the pandemic at a time when other political leaders across government weren't necessarily being as decisive as you were, really stepped out and made a big difference, and I think became a leader across industries. So kudos to you.
No, I really appreciate that. Yeah, no, it was almost exactly 9 months ago. We issued that pledge, the Keep Americans Connected Challenge, and that, for those who don't know, we asked broadband and telephone providers to step up to the plate and commit not to disconnecting consumers who weren't able to pay a bill because of the disruptions, ensure that any late fees were waived, and also to open up Wi-Fi hotspots. And ultimately, almost 800 providers took that pledge, covering the vast majority of American consumers. And to me, at least, is a great example of how a public-private partnership in the pinch of an emergency like a pandemic can be much more successful than just command and control regulation, which would have taken longer, would not have been as successful, and ultimately it would not have met the challenges of the moment. So thank you for focusing on the challenge, the Keep Americans Connected pledge. I think it was a really good, successful initiative.
While we're on the pandemic, just for a moment, maybe you can reflect on, the pandemic has challenged many parts of the industry, of society, but tell us a little bit about leading an agency during a pandemic and what that's been like and what the most surprising thing about it has been and what any unique challenges you want to share.
Yeah, from my perspective, at least, first and foremost, I was worried about the health and safety of our workforce. Our coworkers, as you know, Brian, are just the best asset that any organization could ever ask for. They're tremendously hard workers. They're experts in their field, and they really care about the public interest. And to me, at least, I wanted to ensure that we were doing everything we could to help keep them safe and enable them to do their jobs. And we immediately, I'm pretty sure we were the first, and if we weren't, we were almost the first agency to move to a teleworking arrangement, and that we have been in that situation for several months. Also, we took a lot of steps on the administrative side, like granting administrative leave or other types of dispensations to ensure that if an FCC worker needed to take care of a loved one or go for a medical appointment, we would be able to accommodate that. And those are the types of things I would like to think if you asked any FCC employee, they would say, yes, we knew the Office of the Chairman had our back, and that's why we've been redoubling our efforts on some of the important initiatives that we were entrusted with. And Our workforce is really important to me, and it's, I worry about them a lot, and I wanted to make sure that they were taken care of. And again, I'd like to say that we did that.
All that amidst a once-in-a-generation move for the agency to change locations. How is that going? Smoothly, I presume.
I mean, it's one of the great ironies of 2020, which is, of course, full of them, that I spent a ton of time managing a move into a building that I'll likely never get to see or benefit from. So, the amount of time we've had to spend behind the scenes just, looking at this or that issue and resolving it and making sure that we can move the thousands of boxes from one building to another, and, who could be allowed into the building for classified briefings and all that kind of stuff. It's that's been a lot of work, but nonetheless, hopeful that whenever the agency does move to the new building en masse in person, we'll be able to give them a state-of-the-art building that will allow them to do their jobs just in the same excellent way they've done so in Southwest and before that at 1919 M Street.
I suspect you'll have walkthrough privileges for life, though. So if you want to go back and take a look, I suspect they'll still let you in. I think that comes with the chairmanship, I think.
I hope so. I certainly hope so.
Let's pivot back to policy if we can. Another area where you've really put the agency on a leadership track is 5G through your FAST plan. And tell us about how you think the U.S. is doing vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and sort of what's in the queue. I know a lot of things. One of the ironies of chairmanships, right, is that there's a long tail for the things you set in motion. So we're just now having the C-band auction, which was barely a twinkle in someone's eye 4 years ago, if that, maybe. And there are a host of other things that are already in the queue, including 100 more megahertz at 3.5. But tell us a little about what you've accomplished and where you think we're doing, or how you think we're doing vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
I think the U.S. is doing very, very well indeed. If you look at the building blocks that the FCC has put in place, the 5G FAST plan is really delivered. And that plan, as you know, and as for those who don't, you can go to fcc.gov/5G. But in a nutshell, it included making more spectrum available for the commercial marketplace, number one. Number two, making it easier to deploy the wireless infrastructure of the future. And number three, modernizing our rules to promote fiber deployment. Fiber, of course, being necessary to carry a lot of this wireless traffic back into the core of the networks. And on each of those different planks, I think we've executed in spades. I mean, we've already held several spectrum auctions. We've made available more spectrum over the last 4 years than was previously held by all terrestrial mobile broadband providers combined. We're in the middle of the C-band auction, which you mentioned, where the bidding has been pretty fierce, and it's interesting to see that this mid-band spectrum is highly prized. Same thing with the 3.5 auction we held in the summer, where we made available 70 megahertz of spectrum for 5G. And we've also got a couple other initiatives in the pipeline. The 2.5 gigahertz auction, I hope, will be held next year. And similarly, the 3.45 to 3.55 auction, we hope would be held by the end of next year. That's spectrum currently held by the Department of Defense. On the wireless infrastructure side, too, we've seen 87,000 cell sites deployed in the United States over the last 3 years, 10x what we saw from 2013 to 2016. And in terms of fiber deployment, we set a record in 2018 for deployment of homes and businesses, a record that was only broken in 2019. So, I think we, from an FCC perspective at least, we've really put in place the building blocks, as I said, for innovation and investment in this sector, and importantly, on our shores. And in addition to that, we've also encouraged the infrastructure of the future with the Open Radio Access Network initiative that we've held, or the forum that we've held. We're looking to make sure that the virtualization of those networks thrives here in the U.S. and that some of those companies based in the U.S. Can continue to innovate. So, I think we're in a really good position. I know in some quarters it's popular to say, oh, we're behind such and such country. But if you look at how vast this country is, the challenges we've got, some of the bottlenecks that are in place on the spectrum side, I think we've done exceptionally well. And I think it speaks well of public policy that we were able, in these early innings at least, to set and stage a bright future for the rest of the game.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. People have kicked up a lot of dust around how the FCC has interacted with the executive branch over the last few years on spectrum issues. As your chairmanship comes to a close, what are your thoughts about that process and whether it worked the way it should? Should there be something different? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think what I would say on that topic is it is not so much it has nothing to do with the political affiliation of the executive branch agencies where we've had different issues. It's just the institutional nature of this relationship. The FCC, of course, has jurisdiction over commercial spectrum. The NTIA at the Department of Commerce has jurisdiction over federal spectrum policy, spectrum held by the federal government. And so it's just inherent in that bifurcation that you're occasionally going to find areas where the two might not necessarily be on the same page. There's very little greenfield spectrum available, pretty much none that's useful for wireless communications. So every time the FCC is looking to push forward, you're going to find some federal agency or some private incumbent that will raise an objection. And I think one of the distinguishing features over the last 4 years is that we've rejected the previous approach by some of the folks who held my job in years past, Democrat and Republican, who've just simply said, okay, well, if there's an objection, let's just study it some more, let's kick the can down the road, et cetera. To me, at least, one of the notable features is that we've taken on these hard fights. And the reason why you see some of these stories, FCC battling the Department of Defense or Department of Transportation or Department of Energy or NASA, NOAA, FAA, you name it, is because we recognize that we cannot succeed as a country in 5G if we're standing still and looking at things and kicking the can down the road. We're put in these jobs to make difficult decisions. And every single one of these decisions, I'm proud of the decision we've made because it's been based on the facts and we've defended it strongly. And we're getting the results now in the marketplace.
Excellent. Thank you. So one of the things, from an inside the Beltway issue to an outside the Beltway issue that I suspect your family in Parsons and certainly my family in St. Louis is very appreciative for all the work you've done on robocalls. Perhaps the least popular practice in the industry. Tell us about your work on robocalls, including your most recent item, and tell how are we doing and how much more needs to be done? Have we seen progress?
We have seen progress, and I know it's frustrating to a lot of consumers. It might seem like we're not, but these things drive me crazy too, and I get them all the time, and that's why attacking these unwanted robocalls has been our number one consumer protection priority. And if you look at the full list of things we've done, it's really extensive. We've, for example, enabled phone companies to block robocalls by default. Spoofed robocalls that they determine based on analytics are not legitimate. We've also required the phone industry to implement a new caller ID authentication framework called Shake and Stir, which essentially assigns a digital fingerprint to every single phone call. And now we're seeing carriers agree to exchange traffic only if they have those fingerprints. That's going to attack the problem in a big way in the years to come. We've also set up a reassigned numbers database. So, for example, if someone has a phone number and they use that phone number for their pharmacy, the pharmacy calls back and you reach the new person who gets assigned that number, the pharmacy would now be able to check and make sure that the actual consumer is being reached. And then finally, on the enforcement side, the biggest fines ever proposed in the FCC's history have been imposed on robocallers over the last 4 years, all the way up to $250 million. So, I know that this is a frustrating issue for consumers. It might not seem like there's been a downturn, but we are making substantial headway on this issue. Oh, the other issue I should have mentioned, by the way, is gateway providers. So one of the things we found during the pandemic was that a lot of coronavirus-related robocalls coming in saying, "Oh, we've got a miracle cure. Just press 1 to learn more," that kind of thing. And we found that these were foreign robocalls coming through a so-called gateway provider, very tiny telecom companies that most likely no one had ever heard of. And then those gateway companies were springing these phone calls on the rest of the phone network. So in a joint effort with the FTC and DOJ, we sent letters to almost a dozen of these gateway providers and told them either cease the robocalls within 48 hours or you risk being cut off yourself from access to the U.S. phone networks. And all of them agreed to cut them off. And that's the kind of initiative that we want to broaden to cover more types of robocalls. So frustrating issue, as I know, for many people, but we are making progress.
Excellent. You've also made the FCC a more transparent institution on all these decision-making processes than your predecessors did. Can you detail those efforts and why they were important for you to do as someone who had worked in the building, both as a staffer and as a commissioner before becoming chair?
Oh, that one is, to me, very simple. Good government. I mean, it's just the basic expectation of every citizen that you will be able to understand what the government is doing before it does it. And I never understood when I was a staffer in the Office of General Counsel, and certainly when I was a commissioner in the minority, why the FCC was voting on all these substantial initiatives. We regulate some 1/6 of the economy. Yet we would only make public what our decision was after the vote had happened. And, when I was a commissioner, I would ask my predecessor, why don't we just make it public at least 3 weeks in advance? It would give people more insight into what we're doing. And I was told, well, for legal reasons, we can't do it. There might be some APA issues, or for policy reasons, we don't want to do it because then you just get sucked into a never-ending round of lobbying. But so it never happened. But in my second week in office in February of 2017, we made that change. And it has been a dramatic improvement in the way the agency operates. Everyone, whether in Washington or anywhere in the world, you can now read the exact text of what we're proposing to do or some of the orders that we'd like to adopt. And you can make a decision for yourself. You may like it, you may not, but at least you can understand what it is. And the other interesting thing for the folks who are in Washington, the number of meetings that we've had in connection with the things that we vote on at our monthly meetings has gone down dramatically. And the reason is there's no more game of telephone that's necessary. In years past, what would happen is the chairman would say, okay, we're going to vote on X, Y, and Z at our next monthly meeting. And we won't release the text of it. So what would happen is this fleet of lawyers and lobbyists would have to descend on the FCC and have these kabuki meetings with commissioners and staff where they say, hey, we understand the order would do X. Is that true or is that not true? And we'd have to play this game. Well, what we can say is we think it might be along those lines, but we can't confirm. And just all that kind of ridiculousness is gone now because you can just read it for yourself. And so just in terms of transaction costs saved, I know the communications board might not appreciate it, but we've actually saved a lot of time and effort just by making these things transparent from the get-go.
I was going to say, let's be careful about bad-mouthing the fleets of lawyers, Mr. Chairman, now. But I will say, very much to your credit, as someone who attempted some of these initiatives when they were at the FCC, but I was cowed by OGC, and you obviously were not cowed. So very much to your credit for continuing that battle, because it was a struggle. So kudos to you. So as you look back on your time as chairman, do you have a favorite trip that you've taken, or a place, or a school you visited, or a company you sat down with that really stands out? I mean, you've had some great ones internationally and domestically, but maybe highlight a few to give people a feel for what it's like to be in that chair.
Oh, that's a part of the job that I love so much and I'm really going to miss. I've now visited 49 states and the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands here in the U.S. I've been to many different countries and had a chance to liaise with some of my counterparts. And just the amount that you learn, the people you meet, the issues you get to imbibe, it's just a fascinating aspect of the job. And too many memorable trips to count, but certainly some of the ones that stick out in my mind are getting to meet the Prime Minister of India early this year when as a part of the U.S. delegation. And to me, it was just incredible how the circle had come, how everything had come full circle. My parents left India in 1971. No connections, $8 in their pocket and a transistor radio. And you hear their son, who'd been tapped by the president, was coming back and visiting the Prime Minister of that country. I loved it. And here in the U.S., so many of the people I've met, it just really stick out in my mind. I visited Clay, West Virginia, and Clendenin, parts of the West Virginia that have been ravaged by some flooding recently. And the 911 call center director showed me their office. It was just her and another person. And floodwaters were rising in that call center, and they thought they were going to die. They weren't sure what was going to happen. And I just remember at the end of this meeting, she just gave me a hug and said, "Thank you so much for coming. It just means a lot to know that people out there in Washington care about us." And so many different people I've met like that. The eighth grader at the Jemez Pueblo school that I met in New Mexico, or the ranchers I met in Colorado, or the man I met in North Dakota who was getting gigabit fiber that day, thanks in part to FCC policies. And who told me that he and his wife wouldn't have to bundle the kids up in the truck and drive to Bismarck to piggyback off of what McDonald's Wi-Fi connection. I mean, those are the types of meetings that are going to linger with me long after I leave the FCC, and I'm really glad I did them. It just restores my faith in humanity and the power of government to really affect positive change.
You've spoken often and eloquently about your concerns about the coarsening of our political and policy debates. I remember a Media Institute speech now going on a few years ago, as I recall. But as you exit this stage, what thoughts do you have about how to enhance that dialogue, and how do you think that plays into what comes next for you?
That's a good question. I actually had occasion, a couple of weeks ago, to look at that Media Institute speech back in 2017. And if anything, I really understated how pernicious the effects of social media can be on the way we interact with each other. Back then, I was a little bit more in equipoise, but now I think it's almost indisputable that the way we interact has become much rougher and much less tolerant than it ever was before. And I think partly because we don't have to interact in person, and partly because of anonymity. There's just been a disintermediation of your people. And so it's much easier to lob a bomb when you don't have to look somebody in the eye and say, I think you're wrong for these reasons. And especially for people in office like me, or elected office like the folks in Congress, it's a really difficult situation. And I hope that none of my successors, nobody in government ever has to face some of the crap that I've had to deal with, things I didn't expect coming into the job, unmarked packages being sent to the house, my parents getting harassed with 3 a.m. phone calls, people threatening to murder my children. I mean, that kind of stuff has no place in any civil society, I don't think. And if that persists, then we're going to find a time when people aren't willing to serve in these positions, and they aren't willing to make the right decisions because they're hard. And ultimately, our culture is going to become much more tribal. And I think that's a terrible thing for America. I have a lot of friends on the other side of the aisle. It never would occur to me to castigate them or even end the friendship because their politics are different from mine. But we increasingly see that type of instinct, especially among the young who, haven't known, I don't think, the more pluralistic society we enjoyed as kids. And it would be a shame if that frayed permanently. I don't have any solutions for how to repair it other than either get off social media and treat each other better. But, that's not really a practical solution at this point.
Sounds nice, though, I must say, Mr. Chairman. we should be treating each other better. Maybe we can treat each other better on social media as well. I don't know. Well, as we reach towards the end of our time, I always am curious, what are you going to be doing in late January? Does Janine have like a honey-do list, Mr. Chairman, that you hear the things you haven't been doing for the last 7 years, or what happens? What are the plans?
Well, so no particular honey-do list, and that's because of one of the great domestic calamities for me during the pandemic, which is that working from home, I now have no more excuse for ignoring a lot of things around the house when I have free time that I should have been attending to. So, I've had to do a little bit of drywall work, all those kind of stuff that's just been piling up. But anyway, when January 21st, when I wake up, I'm going to sleep in, drink a big swig of coffee, watch some Judge Judy, and just decompress a little bit. As you know, having served at the commission, it's a challenging job. It's almost a 24/7 job, and looking forward to just exhaling, taking it all in, and trying to think about what the next adventure is going to be. I've been very blessed in my life to have these incredible opportunities presented in front of me, and hopefully, whatever the path ahead it is, it'll be one that's just as intellectually stimulating and rewarding as this one has been.
Well, on behalf of the entire Federalist Society, and from my perspective, I want to thank you so much for both joining us here today and for all the terrific work you've done for the country. We really appreciate it. We need public servants like you in government at all levels who pursue the right things for the American people and do it with class and style and treat others with respect and intellectual rigor. So I very much appreciate that, and thank you for joining us here today.
Well, thanks so much, Bryan, and to you and the panelists who have also been just fantastic advocates and friends over the years. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for helping me during this time in public service. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you once I enter civilian life.
Indeed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
All right, everyone. We are now going to pivot to the panel, the reaction panel part of our conversation today. And for this, I am joined by Randy May, who's the founder and president of the Free State Foundation and a longtime advocate in communications law and policy. Also by Patricia Paoletta, who's a partner in the law firm Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis. And finally by Shane Tews, who I'm hoping has joined us.
I have. Hi, guys.
Yeah, excellent. Who's the president of Logan Circle Strategies and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. All of them have vast government experience and deep policy chops, and I'm thrilled to have such a distinguished panel following the chairman this afternoon. Let's start with a kind of an open-ended opportunity for reactions from any of the three of you to what we just heard over the course of the last half hour.
Bryan, this is Randy, so maybe if it's okay, I'll go first. And give a reaction. But first, I want to thank the Federalist Society, of course, for hosting this session and you for moderating and my fellow panelists as well. I think really we would need a few additional teleforum sessions to do full justice to Ajit Pai's legacy, but this one will be a good start. And I assume that maybe I could ask Nick, just so I'll know whether I'm referring to Chairman Pai directly or what. It sounded like he was dropping off. Is that right, Nick or Bryan?
He's still on, I think, so far, Chairman. Good.
Well, I'm going to speak as if he's on because I know we're recording the session. And I just want to say, that I've been involved in communications law and policy for close to 45 years now. And I don't have any hesitancy in saying that I consider Ajit one of the most consequential chairmen that I've observed. And I should add consequential in a positive way. It's possible to be consequential in a different way. So when I think about the Pai legacy, it could almost be like a trick question because there's a lot from which to choose. But for my part, I'd say without too much hesitation that the chairman's legacy, at least in large part, will be forever tied to his leadership in getting the Restoring Internet Freedom Order adopted to reverse the Obama-era public utility-like regulatory regime applicable to broadband internet providers. I'm not going to go into that at all. I think almost everyone on this call is familiar with the issue. I'll just say that action was important not only because of its more immediate practical and policy impacts, that is encouraging investment and innovation, but also as a statement of fundamental principle that ought to be central to communications law and policy today and going forward. And that principle, of course, is really related to internet freedom in a fundamental way, which is right in the title of the FCC's order, and that is that broadband digital internet services should not be subject to a regulatory regime developed in the last century for monopolistic narrowband analog telephone services. Frankly, upholding that principle was one of the motivations for me to join the think tank world when it was already obvious to me that this was going to be the fight of the next decade back in 2000. I didn't realize it was going to be the fight for the next 2 decades, and hopefully it won't go on forever. But I just think that is a consequential, perhaps in my book, the most consequential action. And I just want to add, initially picking up on something that Bryan asked the chairman about and that he spoke about, and that is it's related to the Internet Freedom Order, of course. It had to do with the ugly attacks that he faced, the personal attacks really on Ajit and his family because of the actions he took. And I'm just going to actually repeat something that I said on the day that Chairman Pai announced his resignation. I said this should never have happened and shouldn't happen again, but Chairman Pai didn't back down. Rather, he responded to those unjustifiable attacks with grace and aplomb. That's a worthy legacy, too. And I really think it is, and he could have responded in a different way that would have perhaps further exacerbated or made it more difficult to get back to a place in which those of us who have been involved in this space for many years or decades hope that we can get back to, where we argue about differences and principle without doing it in a personal way. And I credit Chairman Pai with helping us get to that place by the way he reacted. So with that, Bryan and Mr. Chairman, if you're still on, I'll stop there and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Shane, can I pivot over to you? Tell me, what were your reactions from Ajit's conversation with us?
You know, I always find him refreshing in that he's somebody who's spent a lot of time in different layers in government and is so open about how we can make the process better. I think some of the things he talked about at the very end are so true. The way that the monthly meetings went did not need to be under some sort of cloak and dagger cover, like they were, you know, the FCC spy agency for so long. And it makes for better decision making for everyone. I mean, you know, we can have disagreements, but we need to have them in the open and understand the facts. And sometimes working through those disagreements ahead of time makes for just better decisions all the way around. So huge kudos to that. I hope that continues. And I definitely hope all the work that this has been done the last 4 years around spectrum allocation and spectrum sharing and making the interagency process more effective continues. It's been really great to work with his team.
Tricia, you want to jump in next? Any reactions?
Sure. And thank you, Bryan and Federal Society for hosting this. One of the reactions I was struck with was, listening to your conversation. We're all telecom folks here on this call, but for the broader Federal Society viewership or listenership, what was very special about what the chairman did in response to the pandemic, right, was challenge the industry on a voluntary basis, as you guys discussed, to not disconnect internet access customers, right? Keep America connected, as you guys talked about. And again, it was voluntary. And unlike so much of what we've seen local and governor, mandates come out across the country on COVID, it was voluntary. And I think that's a very important precedent. And he did do it early on. And hopefully that did inspire at least some of the federal folks, if not some of the state and local telecom regulators, to also approach this on more of a partnership level and not mandate expensive regulations that, as he said, would have taken longer to get on the books. And then, of course, as we all know, would probably have never been repealed. So I really commend him and his colleagues for resisting the temptation to mandate and really approach, that aspect of the pandemic to be, on a voluntary basis. So that was very important. And then to pivot from, not backing down, as Randy mentioned, in terms of his bravery. And you guys talked about on the 5G fast plan, getting more spectrum to the market, and of course on across the board, right, on the millimeter wave spectrum, on the mid-band and the low band. And then mid-band had really been a tough nut to crack because a lot of that mid-band spectrum where the industry, and this is the global industry, was targeting, in the 3.5 to 4 gigahertz band. I'll try not to be too technical for our listenership. But yeah, mid-band was considered, nope, it's a no-go zone. We got military radar there. We've got other important uses. And he did not back down, and he really worked with his fellow agencies. And of course, they too understood the economic importance of 5G and the strategic importance of 5G. But, he did not back away from that challenge. So I think that's a very important legacy that he deserves our kudos on. And it was balanced too, right? The 5G fast plan was not just focused on one band of spectrum, as I noted, and it was not just spectrum access, which the FCC can control to some extent when it works effectively with its fellow agencies, but it was also on the state and local siting space, and that was a big fight. And the chairman led that fight, and at the end of the day, has actually expedited the zoning and licensing timelines and costs, reduced the costs. So towns across America can get 4G and 5G radio access networks, put up in much quicker timelines than they used to. So, it worked out. Obviously, nobody knew this COVID, pandemic was coming, but because he and his fellow commissioners got those siting rules streamlined and on the books and kind of through most of the court challenges, by the time COVID hit, local entities around the country were able to scale up and get broadband services out to their populace. So, I do think that the fact that he didn't back down on some tough fights that had bedeviled many Republican and Democrat commissioners and chairs before his time, and the fact that he did, this voluntary approach to respond to pandemic is very commendable.
Brian, can I add one quick thing? A thought that occurred that's different from what we've been talking about, and from your experience as a chief of staff of the commission, you may have a view on it or not. But we're talking about a 5-member commission, of course, that's different than an executive branch agency when there's one person in charge. And one thing that I thought Ajit did especially well was be able to use the other commissioners, particularly those that shared his views on some of these things. Mike O'Reilly, for example, on Spectrum Matters, where he delegated quite a bit of authority to take the lead, and Brendan Carr is another example on infrastructure matters to remove barriers that existed, and Brendan took the lead on that. And it seemed to me from looking at it outside the commission that he was able to maximize to some extent what he was able to get done by employing his colleagues that way, which I thought was a good thing, and I don't think that that's been uniformly done throughout the history of chairmanships at the commission.
It's a great point. Your chairmanship is only as strong as your 3-vote majority on the tough stuff, right? So it's an important point, especially as we're going to have some changeover. Trish, I want to pivot back to you. You spend a lot of time on trade issues and international telecom, and you chair the FCC's World Radio Advisory Committee, if I can remember the name of what we do together. Tell me a little bit about Ajit's role internationally. We've had supply chain, we've had international telecom, we've had satellite issues. How do you think his legacy will be thought of internationally?
Yeah, well, thank you, Brian. Yeah, he kind of mentioned himself how thrilled he was to get to travel with the president to India and to meet the prime minister. I mean, I personally was proud that we had the first, Asian American chair out there, representing us. Obviously, given the issues in some of these international fora, United Nations, there can be some hostility towards the U.S. being arrogant, wealthy, or whatever the issues might be. But I personally was very proud that we had at our helm, a living example of our diversity and our big tent and how opportunity is available to everybody in America. So that was always a special thing for myself. But yeah, he was very engaged in the preparatory work for the World Radio Conference. And, so that was good. His office was very accessible. He traveled, not extensively, because of course, if you travel to really nice places too much, then Congress gets a little jealous and, oversee some of that. But now he was, but more substantively, right? For most of the World Radio decisions, if the U.S. can do stuff domestically at the FCC, that just tends to strengthen our hand. And he understood that. So he was a first mover on the millimeter wave, the higher spectrum that has shorter propagation distances, but, can really deliver huge capacity. So, great for super fast 5G, say in an urban network. He got those decisions on the books early. He, before the World Radio Conference last year, he got the auction started. So it was a great, example to all. And also on the mid-band that we're now starting to see, we had auctions this summer and, and auctions for what we call the C-band, the 3.7 to 3.98, are happening now. Getting those teed up and on the books really helped our efforts to develop support for identifying those mid-band spectrums for basically, 5G. So he was very engaged and he understood the importance as a precedent of FCC leadership to really deliver our goals, internationally.
Thanks, Tricia. Shane, I want to pivot to you to talk about a different constituency. You've spent time at the White House. You spent time as a LD for a congressman. The political side of Capitol Hill especially, and the policy side for that matter, with all your time at VeriSign. Tell us about how you think the chairman did vis-a-vis the Hill and legislation, and is that the FCC is a creature of Congress, so at some level they're the ultimate graders, if you will, of how well a chairman does. So through that prism, how do you think he's done?
Yeah, and let me actually dovetail a little bit off of what Patricia was just talking about. I remember back during the President Bush administration, there was this moment where we had an international meeting, and the other countries were not sure which government person from the United States to seat, because we look at telecommunications differently. We don't have a ministry of communications like most countries do. So they had someone from the State Department there, someone from the FCC, someone from the Department of Commerce through the National Communications Information Agency there, and they didn't know who should be hold the pen or have the discussion, because we look at these issues very differently. And it was to me, that was very poignant on how we were looking at it from a policy perspective, maybe not in a clear enough spectrum on, the importance of telecommunications and technology issues. And I think this particular FCC, a lot of through the chairman's leadership, but also the leadership of his staff, he has very good legal staff. The entire agency is probably the most cohesive that I can remember ever in the time that I've worked with them. So that leads on to also I think they were much more effective on driving policy throughout the legislative process, having better, just engagement and relationships with the chairman of the right committees and the staff there. So the lack of friction and conflict meant that there was a much more cohesive policy within the interagency process. So through the State Department and the Department of Commerce, and even because of spectrum allocation, we have heard from the Department of Transportation, we've heard from the FAA, we've heard from NOAA on issues, and every once in a while you had to put more sunshine on the issue to say, hey, it's a new day. Like Tricia was talking about the mid-band spectrum, we're much better at that now, and how we do the allocation than we did before. So let's rethink the rules that were put in place in the 1980s or 1990s and bring it forward. I realize that some people on this call will understand this and some don't. When it talks about guard bands, anytime you're in an old school, car with a radio and you're like 97.7 to 97.9, why can't I go to 97.8? It's the guard band. We don't need those thick guard bands anymore. And they did a very good job of explaining that, not only within the interagency process, but up on the Hill. And because of that, we have much better spectrum sharing, and we're all going to benefit from that in 5G and next generation networks.
One area where there has been a lot of attention, both on the Hill, elsewhere in the administration, and otherwise, but is supply chain. Do you want to touch on that at all, Shane?
Yeah, absolutely.
And actually, anybody, because it has been a big, area of focus for the chairman.
So most specifically, I think people in this arena think about what's going on with the open radio access networks, the ORAN. And what used to happen is you would be locked into a particular vendor. And that was because so much of technology and telecommunications was hardware driven. And what we have done is now we consider the box. The box is now just a device that can take on different software. And because of compute power being so much more prevalent because of cloud computing. So basically, technology has made telecommunications assets and networks much smarter. That means that we can use money more efficiently in the network. That is not necessarily going to a lot of sunk hardware, but we're using it and being able to update, the software process. So the Open Radio Access Network allows many more companies to be engaged in that process and to have the ability to be in the supply chain. And one thing that's very important about that is national security. And that's been a concern about, Huawei is, and we just went through the rip and replace, order in the last meeting, that, we want to trust our vendors. And unfortunately, trust starts a lot of times with zero trust. You have to build your trust into the network, and then you can know who you're dealing with. It's very key to supply chain. So that, in a world where things can change through software, we may have a better ability to do that, but you have to be able to trust the hardware that is the initial key. And so that's where we've seen supply chain have some really interesting twists and turns over the last couple of years. But I think we're really, getting to a good point where our supply chain is going to be a value of trust that we can have going forward.
And to follow up on that, if I may, Bryan, again, the chairman was out in front on this. I mean, he actually released the supply chain order, whatever it was called, rip and replace order, well before the president actually did his executive order, directing all the different executive branch agencies, that have an intel or security competency. And there was a section in there about, and hey, and FCC, you too, do what you can to make our supply chain more secure. But the chairman had already put out a notice of proposed rulemaking saying, hey, we administer this $1 billion fund for helping to support broadband and telephone, universal service across the country. Should we really be using those taxpayer dollars or those, consumer dollars to support the installation of Huawei equipment and other perhaps untrusted or non-trusted network vendors? So he actually got that ball rolling well before the president's even executive order a couple of years back, and therefore was in a position, as Shane just mentioned, to actually make decisions on that, which as well as support workshops or shine the light on open radio access networks that Shane was talking about. So basically, if once upon a time you bought a Huawei switch, you're not stuck with Huawei forever and a day. You actually can break apart that and put in different parts of the network and not be reliant on Huawei for the rest of your network's life.
Right.
Randy?
Can I just pick up on what Shane and Trish said, maybe take it in a little different direction and make a broader point that I think you'll appreciate. One thing, these issues that we've been talking about, like supply chain and some of the spectrum issues and others, are really new. Some of them are new in some sense to the FCC, and they just didn't. The FCC didn't deal with those things, or at least nearly as intensively in past years. I know that wasn't true when I was there and a long time ago, and to some extent, I don't think it was when you were there. So the point that I want to make is that this commission under Ajit's leadership just turned out an incredible amount of work. I mean, the productivity under often very tight deadlines, to me, was pretty amazing when I think back over the years to other commissions. And, I give that's a tribute to his leadership and his colleagues. It's also a tribute to the staff of the FCC, something that, Ajit said earlier during this hour, but it's just, to me, pretty darn amazing how much they were able to get done in a relatively short time, and that doesn't happen without hard work and leadership.
Indeed. So I guess an open question. We only have about 5 minutes left, but maybe each of you can jump in for sort of a lightning round. What do you think is the most underappreciated accomplishment of the Pai era? And what do you think will be the issue in the next 4 years where you most wish that you had Chairman Pai, you'll most wish we still had Chairman Pai at the helm?
Well, one that I think got quite a bit of attention, but maybe people didn't realize was a suicide hotline. And part of this is being from the great state of Nebraska, where we actually started 911. And there was an understanding back then that you needed something that was a very quick response. And I know it'll take time for the new number to populate, but understanding that there was a national need for people to be able to reach out and get help, and using our system, our telecommunications system for that. I think that was, he read the report, his team saw that was important, and they acted on it very quickly. I thought that was great.
This is Randy. I guess I would go back to what I said earlier when I first spoke. I wish it weren't so, but I believe the fight over broadband regulation is going to continue. I know we all talk about how much we would like a congressional resolution of the issue, and I can second that. But I think the reality is that fight is probably going to continue, and there is a broad. I think the differences really are meaningful and important in terms of of whether you end up with an approach like Chairman Wheeler adopted or Chairman Pai. It makes a big difference. I think, to me, that's the most important issue probably going forward. And I think, again, I'll just say again, to me, was the most consequential action that was taken under Ajit's leadership during his tenure.
And most unappreciated, maybe it's the most unimportant, who knows, but I always appreciated his sense of humor. And in the face of a lot of, political jabs from his colleagues, and of course a horrible slate of hate Twitter and, the threats, I mean, he kept a sense of humor, and I think it's a great role model, because I think he's right. It's not going to get too much better out there in our divisive polity, but I think that was, very important. And I forget what the legacy question was, but hopefully that's a legacy too.
They actually go pretty well together, Tricia. I actually really like that. I do think, it's interesting. I think I might just land on. I'm going to answer this question myself since I like it. I might land on C-band, because I'm always impressed with anytime a chairman can kind of bring an idea into the conversation and then close on it within their chairmanship. Right. And I always gave Julius great credit for this on the incentive auction. It's a very hard thing to go from sort of, apple or a twinkle in the eye to an executed battle plan. And C-band really did that, and it was bumpy, right? Landing that plane was very, very complicated for them, and I give them great credit for that one, as near and dear to my heart as it was. Do I have any final thoughts from our panelists? Of any additional thoughts on the Pai legacy? Or
well, I'll just add the C-band is a critically important action, and that is the 5G global band of interest, including with 3.45 and 3.55. And so I agree, it's hugely impressive that, he could get done, and it was, very complicated because of, the satellite antennas, the dishes seeing the whole arc and this, that, and the other thing. But I think it will be appreciated. So I'll second that it's a very important legacy.
A lot of politics from the Hill that, of course, got involved.
You don't every day have a senator come in and sit in an FCC open meeting, so that was maybe historic. I don't know, but
not in the way you want to make history.
No.
Any final words, Shane?
I would say the biggest compliment and thing we could do for his legacy is keeping the Restoring Internet Freedom Order intact.
I agree.
Well,
I second that.
I third it, but we live in a world filled with humans.
We do indeed, and a political construct where change has consequences, I guess. But at any rate, all right. Well, thank you all very, very much on behalf of the society. I want to thank you all. Thank Chairman Pai for joining us. Thank all of our audience members. We really appreciate your participating in this event for the Telecommunications and Media Practice Group. We welcome your joining and your participation in our group's activities. And I hope everyone has a happy and safe holiday season. Take care.
Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Federalist Society.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bryan. Great close. I'll just ask for our audience, thanks for calling in. You can reach us at info@fed-soc.org. and check your emails on our website for announcements about upcoming telephone calls. So on behalf of the Federalist Society, thank our experts for calling in. Thanks, Bryan, for moderating.
Thank you, Nick.
Have a great week. We are adjourned.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Teleform, a podcast of the Federalist Society's practice groups. For more information about the Federalist Society, the practice groups, and to become a Federalist Society member, please visit our website at fedsoc.org.